There are people that still look at me as an Igbo guy and see in me some extension of Ojukwu. And there's people that are still looking at an Hausa guy that's just passing and seeing in him an extension of Muritala Muhammad. We're still seeing the past in each other because of the stories we're being told. We need to look at our history with the intention to heal and build bridges.
Source for better ways of generating revenue. The House of Representatives is yet to approve this request.
Introducing the Big Issue Show.
Elections are turbulent, primal times, and this is even for the most homogeneous of countries. And then take Nigeria, where we're not that homogeneous. Elections represent for us often a descent into hardline commentary, especially rhetoric that revolves around these markers that should identify us, but rather we use as divides: ethnicity, religion, any other social stratification markers. That is the bane of almost our entire existence, especially when all of these political and social issues or conversations come up. We finished an election a few months ago, and yet the country is yet to return to the lower hardline rhetoric that we had pre-election. Why is this so? Why have these conversations remained very toxic, so to speak? And why does it seem like we're unwilling to bridge these differences that we should be using more as stepping stones to greatness? Rather, we've settled on them as reasons for divides. You're watching The Big Issue. My name is Buchi Onyegbule. This is the show where we talk about big ticket issues that affect all and sundry across the 36 states of the Federation and, of course, the FCT. We'll talk about this when we come back. This is The Big Issue, and today I'm joined by Dike Chukwumerije. He just simply prefers to describe himself as a poet, and I'm pretty sure you all know who he is. You heard my introduction, Dike. Welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
And I know that this is a conversation you and I have had often, you know, away from air, and sometimes even on air. But we talk about all of this like it's a mainstay for us, right? And before we even come to the fact that, you know, elections sort of trigger it, we have to first examine the reality that these are things that are triggerable, so to speak, if we could coin that language during elections. If it didn't exist, if the angst didn't exist, there would be nothing to trigger during elections. So let's see if we can trace it, you know, to the beginning. There are many who can say, who often say the reason for these ideological fissures is because, you know, we are in some sort of unholy union from the way and manner we were designed or meshed together as a unit with very little consensus from the different units in the country. And that's why it seems like it can't work. And perhaps that's where we can start this conversation from. Is this maybe an age-old belly aching that, you know, we seem to have never let go of? Or is there validity to this thinking?
That's an interesting perspective. The idea that we were doomed from the start because of how we were put together. It's a very popular notion out there, you know, that's because Lord Lugard put us together. That's why we have issues. But I always tell people that every nation is constructed. There are no natural nations, no country descends from heaven. Somebody has to put a nation together. And if you look at the history of probably every nation on earth, whoever it was that put it together didn't ask the opinion of everybody that was going to be a citizen of that country. When the founding fathers in America were drafting their Declaration of Independence, they didn't ask the women, they didn't ask the Native Americans, they didn't ask the African Americans, they didn't ask the poor white men if they wanted to be part of the United States of America. They just went ahead and created their country. Countries in Europe were created out of war and conquest. We're not the only country born out of colonialism. Britain, France, Germany, these were all outputs of Roman conquest and colonialism of Europe. And on the flip side, you have a country like Ethiopia in Africa that has never been colonized, but is still saddled with the same issues that we face. So it doesn't really matter how you were born as a nation. Some nations have a rough start, like Rwanda, but then they pick up and they begin to run, you know. Everything rises and falls with leadership, attitude, orientation, mentality. So there's nothing unusual about the way Nigeria was born. Nigeria was born in the same way many countries across the world was born, and they're all doing well. Many of them are doing well. And so the issues are with us, our mentality, how we think of ourselves, how we conceptualize that nation. I don't even think Lord Lugard was the one that constructed Nigeria. I think Nigeria was inevitable. If you look at the history of what I call the Niger area, that is the area around the River Niger, you will see that this area has been a prolific producer of states through history. Right from Nok civilization thousands of years ago, Igbo, Yoruba, Edo, Kanem. This place has never been devoid of a formal, strong state, because in the end, it is geography that is the mother of states. As long as the geographic conditions are conducive, and when you have water, you will always have civilization and life. So there's always been civilization and life in the Niger area. Nigeria is just the latest incarnation of a long line of Niger area states. So there's nothing unusual about us, how we came to be. If Lord Lugard hadn't done it, somebody else would have done it. It's not an area that will ever be void of civilization and life. What matters, whether there will be peace and development, solely depends on the quality of leadership and the mentality of the people.
We'll get to the quality of the leadership in a bit. Let's talk about the mentality of the people. Also because I'm a very strong believer in the fact that, well, maybe not the fact, I'm a very strong believer in the idea that leadership is often a reflection of its people, right? Because it's not aliens, it's not Somalians who come in and be president of Nigeria. So let's talk about that mentality then. Why does it seem like we've been unwilling to shake this, to lose these shackles that have sort of held us towards thinking in terms of regionality and focusing on these things that identify us as a people, this siege mentality divide, so to speak? Why are we unable to shake that mentality?
Unfortunately, it was embedded into our very foundations as a nation. The actions of your founding generation has a great impact down the line. So that first generation of Nigerians who negotiated the independence of the nation and started the nation off had a strong culture of parochialism and partisan politics. And it has simply filtered down through the ages. We are simply walking in the footsteps of our founders, and that's a very strong foundation to lay. I mean, there are other neighboring countries that had a slightly different dynamics at their start, like Ghana. Ghana was fortunate to have an Nkrumah. So Ghana is able to have one figure that everybody looks up to and reveres. But in Nigeria, we have multiple figures. So from the very beginning, we don't have one national figure that we all revere equally, which is a very important factor in unifying a people.
Like a father of the nation, like Julius Nyerere, for example, in Tanzania.
You know, or mother of the nation. Yeah. But just that figure that brings everybody together. So whatever part you come from, you're able to look at that person and see in that person some ideal type of what your citizen should be. So unfortunately, we didn't have that at our beginning. So we had our political culture from the very beginning was fragmented. And foundations are very important. You know, so that's one of the reasons why Nigeria is why we have that mentality. Parents download from parent to child, it goes on. And then secondly, we had the year 1966, which is one of the most traumatic years in Nigerian history, 2 coups and a civil war that created so much animosity and bitterness, further poisoning the waters. And in many ways, we're still living in the shadow of 1966. So to move forward, we need to create a narrative that can unify Nigerians across regions and ethnic groups. We need to create that unifying figure or ideology. And then we also need to heal the wounds of 66.
Many people, when we talk about, when we have these conversations, very often, just as you've done, default to talking about 66. And there's this common view that we've not really addressed it or, talked about it as a people, as a collective, to be able to move on. And it's over 50 years now, and we're still haunted by the ghosts of 1966, and then, of course, the different activities through the war. Why do you think we are unwilling to, or we have been unwilling to talk about it as a people? And what do you think is the ideal way to actually face it head on?
It's a very sensitive topic, and many people are wary of it because they fear that talking about it may reawaken, maybe like reopening wounds. So many people stay away from it because they don't want to reopen certain wounds. But the problem is that there is a difference between the public narrative on 66 and the conversations people are having in their bedrooms. So publicly, many people say, look, this thing is in the past, let's move on. But in their bedrooms, they're telling their children differently. This tribe, this person, or you can't marry this person from this tribe, and look, this is what they did to us, or this is what... Those conversations are still happening privately. As long as they're still happening privately, people that were born long after 66 are still carrying the mentality of 66. So there are people that still look at me as an Igbo guy and see in me some extension of Ojukwu or Efiajuna. And there's people that are still looking at an Hausa guy that's just passing and seeing in him an extension of Muritala Muhammad and things like that. We're still seeing the past in each other because of the stories we're being told in the bedroom and behind closed doors. And I think the safest way, it's a very hot topic issue. And I think it needs to be addressed by people who are seeking reconciliation. Not people who want to use history as a way of reigniting a second Biafran war or settling scores that they feel.
Or building a political platform.
Or building a political platform. I think we need to look at our history objectively, first of all, with the intention to heal and build bridges, and with the knowledge that in these historical actions there were no saints. Everybody's hands were stained. A willingness to accept the fault of those who come from your tribe, and a willingness to see the humanity of those who did what they did from another tribe. That these were just people in their 20s and their 30s. Many of them were angry and they didn't have the perspective we have of, look, this is the consequence of your actions 50 years later. They didn't know that. They were young people. So we need to look back with empathy, with objectivity, to tell the whole story. Because what happens is that if you go to one section of the country, you will hear one part of the story. If you go to another section of the country, you hear another part of the story. So we need somebody that will bring all these parts together and tell the whole story. And say, yeah, this person wasn't right, this person wasn't right, this is actually what happened. We just need to tell the whole story of 66 in an objective way. And I think it's very doable. And perhaps the generation that will do it is coming. Or is here.
Oh, you don't? Which is actually what leads me to that question I want to ask. Because when we started this show, the first show had Dr. Joaba, and we were talking about, the things that we needed to see, from a new government and all of that, the responsibilities of government, and looking at, stumbling blocks towards our growth. And one of the things he kept harping upon was setting the tone, right? Because when you're talking about this now, you're talking about a generation to come, or perhaps one that's already here. But we do know that you talked about leadership as well. So the leadership has to set the tone.
Absolutely.
So I want you to wear a hat that you probably never thought you would ever wear, right? Just imagine for a brief moment that you're responsible for the country and you want to engage on 66. At least to be able to take away that weapon that this ethnocentric champions usually default to. How would you play this? What's your play here?
Yeah. If I were suddenly by some miracle in charge of the country,
it would be a huge miracle.
Having to lead a narrative like that, I'll be conscious of the fact that I come from the Southeast and I'm an Igbo person. And one of the first things I would like to communicate to the rest of the country is that I understand and I acknowledge the gravity of what was done on 15th of January 1966.
That's where we should start from.
Yes. As an Igbo person, that's where I will start from, because that's what others have against us. And I would acknowledge that the murder of the Sadaunas was wrong, of Mai Malari, of Yakubu Pam, of Abogula Gema, of Tafawa Balewa. These things were wrong. And that they caused a great deal of hurt on the northern side. I would hear their story. I would acknowledge that, yes, that it was wrong. I think that's where, to begin reconciliation, you start with yourself. And then when we cross that bridge, I would then like other parts of the country to understand that that thing they call pogrom is euphemism, that it was genocide. Long before the Rwandan genocide, there was a genocide here where people are singled out and murdered just because of their ethnicity. You know, that is something as a country we need to stop and acknowledge and say that was wrong and it should never happen again. So that's how I would start, with a willingness to hear you and acknowledge your hurt and not say it doesn't matter. And then when we've crossed that bridge, I would like you to hear me and acknowledge my hurt and not say it doesn't matter.
Okay, let's not dwell too much on statistics, and I absolutely agree with you that that's perhaps how to talk about this, you know, and acknowledging, you know, everyone's pain points and looking at how to, you know, move on from there. I'd like to talk about the unity of the country and some of the statements that, or some of the ideals that most of the leaders have sort of expressed. In 2018, the president, as of then, Muhammadu Buhari, had actually made a statement where he said Nigeria's unity is discussed, is non-negotiable. In fact, I'm going to quote what he said. Nigeria's unity is settled and not negotiable. We shall not allow irresponsible elements to start trouble, and when things get bad, they run away. Let's ignore the irresponsible elements part. We'll come back to that later. But his statement about Nigeria's unity being settled and non-negotiable, it caused a furor, you know, back then. And yes, understandably, it was an election year. So it made me actually go back, you know, to check. And almost every president, you know, almost all of his predecessors had actually made this same statement almost word for word. In fact, his successor has done the same. And so, but the fact that there was a huge part of the country that pushed back against such a statement, you know, even if you say, oh, there's politics here, you know, it's a political year and the opposition will always counter. But it's a large enough number for you to want to stop to think, to say, wait, do the rest of the country actually think, or is there a large section of the country that actually think that maybe this unity is not so non-negotiable?
I would say that that statement is a statement that any president of Nigeria should make. There is no president of any country that wants to see that country broken up under their watch. And you're the president. You can't be the one equivocating on the matter of unity. Because if the president is equivocating, then the country is gone. So I can't fault a president of a country. The president of America will not get up and say American unity is negotiable. The prime minister of UK wouldn't say the same. No leader of the country would want that country broken up under their watch.
Yeah.
So it's a very reasonable statement.
It's expected.
It's mandated, it's expected that you make that statement. And we are in a democratic regime. We live in a democracy. There's freedom of expression. Those that disagree with that statement can express themselves. But you cannot put different words in the mouth of a leader of a country. Even if the president of Nigeria came from the southeast, I would not expect him to say Nigerian unity is negotiable. Okay. Because then you're not qualified to be president of Nigeria if you think that way. You know, you're the leader of a country, that's your position. Anybody that disagrees can express.
Okay, we'll take a very quick break, and when we come back more in this conversation, Dike Chukwumerije, who simply describes himself a poet, has joined me today on The Big Issue to talk about Nigeria's diversity, Nigeria's unity, and not necessarily about whether or not it's non-negotiable, but why this is such a huge pain point for us, especially when we examine national issues. My name is Buchi Onyegbule, and I'll be right back. Welcome back to The Big Issue. Dike Chukwumerije has joined me, for the past few minutes, and we've been talking about Nigeria's diversity and managing it. Dike, we talked about the setting of the tone. You had talked about the president and what they need to do, but first of all, you talked about the president's role in setting the tone for unity in addressing the civil war. But beyond the civil war, there are other reasons for the ideological fissures that we have. Yeah. So what other roles should we be looking at the leadership to play in terms of managing this diversity properly?
In terms of managing our diversity properly, there's a huge role that leadership has to play. In fact, the role of framing the narrative is a role leadership may kickstart, but it's really society itself that needs to have that conversation. But for leadership, there are certain hard parameters that have to be put in place for people to coexist peacefully. For instance, we need a fair system, a system of transparent and predictable rules. It's a huge infrastructure for peace. It's like having a fair referee in a very contentious football match. Once you put a fair referee, it turns from a bloodbath to sports. Yeah. We can enjoy it. And one of the reasons why a little quarrel between maybe an Hausa guy and a Yoruba guy in some market will escalate into a full-blown ethnic war is a lack of effective, independent referees. And by that, you're looking at the public sector itself, police officers, public administrators, that have rules everybody knows. When you come into this place, this is the seat for Igbo people, this is the seat for Yoruba people. We all know why they kept this one for Igbos, we know why they kept this one for Yorubas. The system is not manipulated. When you have a transparent system, there's less room for conflict. So that's a context that government needs to create, a culture of transparent, predictable rules. That in itself will reduce conflict for people. Then you need a strong respect for fundamental human rights. So that regardless of our diversity, there is a common pool of rights that I have as a Nigerian citizen. Whether I'm in Kano or Bayelsa or wherever I go, I know that there is a basic minimum that I have. That's another important investment that government can make in managing diversity effectively. These are just two, but they are really important. So it's not just all about rhetoric. There's hard governing and administering that has to be done when people who see themselves as rivals have to coexist in one space. You have to have rules, and you have to have an independent, objective administrator of those rules. That alone will bring the potential for conflict down considerably.
I absolutely agree with you, and it shows in the way that the government responds to incidents. If I knew that when I go out to vote, I would not be targeted based on my ethnicity.
Absolutely.
Right? Or based on what part of the country I am and who I want to vote for in those places. If I knew that I had a government that would protect that particular fundamental right as you described, then it's easier for me to feel part of the union. And so talking about that puts a lot of responsibility, and deservedly, with the government. But the second part of the former president's statement talks about irresponsible elements, and we cannot pretend that they do not exist, even if they're playing on very valid sentiments that people already have, or resentments that have not been addressed, and so they're easy to be weaponized. But it does not change the fact that we do have these unscrupulous elements who are players in the scene and who use these cracks, these fissures, to create even sharper divides. But you're not going to remove that because they exist everywhere in the world. But at what point does our own agency as a people come in? Because a populist demagogue, even if it's a schizophrenic one, like we've seen from where we're from, they exist based on the acceptance or general belief by the people that, a support, so to speak. That's why it's called populism, right? It's popular. Yeah. So where's our own agency as a people, to be able to say, no, I do not subscribe to this. No, you shouldn't be weaponizing this. No, this is going to harm us in the long term. Where does that come in? And why are we not exercising it more than we should?
Well, firstly, from the perspective of leadership, when you're dealing with these sorts of ideologies in society, you have to use both soft and hard tools. Because there's a thin line between freedom of expression and hate speech.
Yeah.
And you have to be careful that the fact that you don't like what somebody is saying does not mean you need to shut them up.
Yeah.
You need to draw that line very finely. And if an ideology has roots in society, then you need to understand that there has to be a lot of orientation that takes place. That you need to counter ideology with ideology, not with bullets or bombs. You can't kill an ideology with bullets or bombs. That's on the part of leadership. Then on the part of us as a people, what happens is that, particularly on this issue, people who believe in Nigeria, or in one Nigeria, are not as outspoken, are not as articulate, are not as clear, are not as confident when they speak as people that don't. So there is a lot of reservation in the way they speak because, I won't say Nigeria beforehand, Nigerian government beforehand. So when you're arguing for Nigeria, people are countering you with, look at the country you're arguing for.
Speaking for.
There's no light, there's no what. But these are the actions of the government. The government is different from the nation. A nation can have potential. You can speak to the potential, the future of a nation, separate from what the state is doing. The state is today. We're talking about long-term future. So what we have is people who believe in Nigeria are not articulate enough. Sometimes are not confident enough to speak up. And so their own voices are muted, while those who don't are loud. So we need to gain confidence and articulation, and we need to know what Nigeria is. It's a very simple question, but it's also very profound and difficult to answer. What is Nigeria? America would say is a land of the free. It's the
home of the brave.
The home of the brave. Britain would characterize itself as a lion. China is a dragon. Russia is a bear. What is Nigeria?
Super eagle.
Even when you say, you laugh because it's always like a joke.
Yeah.
At the best you think of super eagles and football. But what is our character? What is our ideology? What values represent our nation? Until we're clear about those values, then we can't speak for Nigeria because we don't know what Nigeria is. If you remember the famous speech by Martin Luther King, he was asking racist America to live up to the ideals of the American nation. Essentially, he was saying, what you guys are not acting American, because this is not what America is. But we who believe in Nigeria, because we don't know what Nigeria is, what is Nigeria's values, we're unable to say that you guys are not acting Nigerian. Because what is Nigeria?
But is a people not a reflection, or rather is a nation not a reflection of the people? Because beyond the geography, if I'm in Qatar, for example, and I turn and say, who are you? I'm Nigerian. I'm currently in Qatar, or rather at that point I'm in Qatar. But I'm saying I'm Nigerian. It's not necessarily about the geography. But it's more about the people and where I originate from. So is a nation not a reflection of the people? Can we create Nigerian values that are not organic in terms of what the average Nigerian represents?
Yes, of course. That's what nation building is. A nation is different from the state and is different from the people. If it were not, then America has no business characterizing itself as a land of the free because it was built on slavery and oppression. The way it characterizes itself is diametrically opposed to its own
to what
history,
the reality
to what its people did.
Still do.
And still do. So, but nation building is about conceptualizing your nation in an idealistic way, holding it, representing it as a system of values to which you can hold both state and society accountable, both state and society. So both you can tell people that your conduct is not reflective of the ideals we ought to be living up to. So the question is, what are those ideals? And ideals are found in aspirations. That's the difference between us and Western countries. They define themselves by the aspirations of their founders, not by their actions. We define ourselves by the actions of our founders, not by their aspirations. And that's where the problem lies. That's why we don't know what Nigeria is. Because you're looking at what Ahmadu Bello, what Zik, what Awolowo did. But you're not reading about what they were aspiring to. Because it's what they were aspiring to. That's the homework they've left for you. They did the best they could in their circumstances. But now if you know where they were trying to get to, you are able to pick up the gauntlet and continue. But the problem is that we don't know this and we're not taught this. But in countries that have a strong sense of national identity, they are taught this, what their ideals are. And that's what is lacking in our educational system. If that was more prominent, then it's easier for people to say, this is beneath us as Nigerians. This is not who we are, which is what you hear Westerners say all the time, and you laugh. What is beneath you? You people have been killing people for centuries. But they have such a strong concept of themselves as idealistic people. And that really helps to put that pressure on what people and government are doing today. So that's one of the main things that Nigeria lacks. There's no proper conceptualization of what Nigeria is.
Of what the journey should be, where we're supposed to be headed.
Why we should exist. What is our unique contribution to global world civilization? You know, there are Americans who believe that the world will be a darker place if America ceases to exist.
American exceptionalism.
It's a very important aspect of identity. When you feel that there is something unique you contribute, not just to but to the whole world. And Nigeria is one of the few countries that can claim to be able to make a unique contribution to world civilization, because we have certain things about us that no other country has. For instance, we're the largest black nation in the world. There's no other country. That already makes you unique. And if you have a unique feature, then you must have a unique purpose. So these are some of the steps you take towards constructing a sense of national identity, national vision, so that you realize that there is more at stake. This outside Igbo Fulani tussle, there is more at stake. That there are things that the world will not experience until we get our act together. So these are some of the things that as a people we need to do. I don't believe that crafting the narrative around, because I believe nation is fiction. Nation is fiction, is a story. Somebody has to tell that story around which a national identity forms. I don't think it's the responsibility of politicians. I think it's the responsibility of actors in society to craft that story.
I feel like you've taken me to school a bit, and I'm fine with that. Because you talked about what is lacking in our educational system. But at the beginning of this show, you also talked about the things that are said in public as different from the things that are said in the privacy of the home. And as we've seen very often expressed on social media, in forums, in places where people don't expect to get opprobrium for the things they say, we've seen many people talk about things or other people in ways that you can tell that they inherited or they learned from the influential figures when they were growing up, from the father, from the mother, from the uncle, from this grandfather who say they saw the war and can tell them the story of the war from the lenses that they have. So in the public space, we can manage or define the things that are said. This is not okay. Yes, this is fine. You can say this, but think about how you offend the next person who hears it. But how do we now manage the other things that are said in the spaces where the person you're talking about cannot hear it? So if I grew up with the hate of the average Birom man or the average Fulani man that's taught to me by my father, who may or may not have lived with them, but has understood them the way he did, but he's talking to me in the privacy of our home where his word is law. right? And as a young person, I'm a sponge. I'm literally soaking these things in. How do you manage that situation? What are the options left?
The gateways or the point of entry to really changing the narrative in the private spaces is 1, religion, 2, education, 3, what I call popular culture. So religion is very important. These civic values must be expressed from religious pulpits so that people can hear it and take them home. Tolerance, empathy, respect must be cloaked in the language of Scripture for both Christians, Muslims, and believers in others. Because these values are universal, they are spiritual values, and you'll find them in every Scripture. They need to tolerate one another. And these are some of the things that need to be preached and taught, because religion has access to those spaces in a way that politicians don't, or political talk doesn't. Then 2, education, basic education. From primary school, we need to start learning about other cultures, other religions. We need to start learning about respect and empathy, what these things mean. We need to start reinterpreting our history from that stage. That will also make an impact on those private conversations. And 3, art and culture, music, all the Burna Boys and the Davidos, because they speak to young people, and young people absorb what comes out of the lyrics of popular entertainment forms. And so that's another important channel through which values can be inserted into the hearts of people and affect them in those private spaces. But it's something that you have to be every country is very strategic about its arts sector, its cultural sector. In fact, in many countries, the government funds it.
Yes.
Because they understand that it's an important tool for crafting narrative and sorting out some of these issues long before they become political issues.
Yes.
But in Nigeria, we abandon art and culture completely. So it's an important tool, religion, education, and then popular culture.
All right, thank you very much. I know that it's going to be hard to tell it's like when someone says, you know, the uneducated are the problem with Nigeria. You know, when they want to talk about hate and bigotry and whatnot, you know, they say, oh, you know, that person who has never met the Igbo man hates the Igbo man because he thinks the Igbo man is XYZ. And we say the average farmer, how do you go tell him to go love the other person? But you see, the problem is that average farmer has no reason to hate the other person because they haven't met them.
Yeah.
They don't know them. They're
Absolutely.
Thinking about, how do I eat? How do I get food to feed my kids? How do I survive? Yeah. It's the person who has actually interacted with the other group who has to come and teach that hate.
Absolutely.
And so, yeah, I absolutely agree with you. It's in this other means that we can attempt to, you know, push back on some of these beliefs. Yeah. And then the other question I want to now ask, which is perhaps the way to round up the conversation. The persons who come up to weaponize this divide, because these silos exist already, right? Especially with social media, these silos exist, and everybody seems to be drifting more and more into siege mentality. And then there are people who come up and say and think, I can build a platform off this, and I can use it to do stuff. What can we do? How can we push back against them directly? And I'm not talking about, you know, our own agency as a people. I don't believe this. I don't want to do this. But we have situations where we can actually see actual leaders supporting some of these people, right? You have prominent people who whipped up ethnic sentiments at the last elections. We didn't see punishment for that. A few years ago, we had governors in the Southeast, for example, taking pictures in front of the government house with someone who was pushing very clearly for the splintering of the country. So we're seeing acts of irresponsibility, both from the leadership and then from those themselves who are the miscreants, so to speak. So what is the antidote to that, to those particular people?
What you've described can only be solved by what I had mentioned earlier, a state that is conscious of its role as an objective, effective referee in a very messy battle. So it's a football match, Chelsea is playing, Arsenal, Derby. You know that it's going to be tense. So So you need quality refereeing. And the Nigerian state at the moment is unable to provide quality refereeing because many politicians are themselves partisan. We don't have enough patriots in power. So we saw what happened in the last elections where there was very obvious ethnic baiting and no consequences. So what moral authority do you have as a state when you are practicing tribalism yourself to now look at somebody in society who has watched what you're doing and is now doing his or her own thing? The state lacks moral authority to intervene in those issues because it's partisan itself. And many times it is the partisan nature of the state that is feeding what you're seeing in society. So I'm one of those that believes that the solution is in the reform of the state itself. That these people that you're seeing in society jumping up to say break up Nigeria is because of what the state is doing. Not so much as because they have some clear, identified ideology and objective and they are clear about what they're doing. Because many times they are reacting to you, to your corruption, to your greed, to your tribalism, and then you are punishing them. So there's an injustice that's happening that many people who don't support what they are doing but are rankled by the injustice of what's happening, where the thief is the one that is saying is going to catch thief. Or the tribalist person is the one that is pointing finger and saying you're tribalistic. So we really need a reform of the state, where the state understands that it cannot descend into the arena of tribalism. I was particularly pained by, some of the things that happened in the lead up to or during the last elections, where because you want to win an election, you're willing to start a battle between two ethnic groups. People were willing to knock the heads of Yorubas and Igbos together because they want to win elections. And yet if you succeed in doing that, anybody can be consumed in that. It can be your own child walking down the street who is waylaid and beaten up just because of his ethnic group. Anybody. But you can see this lust for power that doesn't care, that is willing to throw society into a conflagration in order to win. Those are not the kinds of people that we need in power. We need people who, no matter what is at stake for them personally, will never put the peace, the inter-ethnic harmony and balance at risk in order to achieve their own personal objectives.
Because it also makes no sense. If you win and the society is splintered, it makes governance nearly impossible for you.
It makes it impossible. So it's so short-sighted. And then you can imagine somebody who plays that kind of politics, comes into power, and then the next day they are preaching one Nigeria. Everybody is
it's hard to swallow.
It's hard to swallow. You cannot intervene in anything that's going on because you've demonstrated that it's all rhetoric. And that is the root problem.
To end the show, I want to come to you now as a father, right? We've talked about all of these things, the responsibilities outside. Let's talk about the responsibilities in the home. Right? I'm not a father yet, hopefully at some point in time. But I know that I do not want to raise a child who will say some of the things that I see people echo on social media. Absolutely agree that, the leadership creates XYZ situation. We have pillars of society, whether in religious institutions or traditional institutions. I do remember one particular traditional leader who contributed to the Oso Buhari in 2017 or 18 about, creating suspicions that the president was trying to inject people in the southeast with monkeypox and things like that. That's a clear failure of local leadership as well.
Absolutely.
So but we agree that all of that exists, but I don't want to raise a son or a daughter who's going to come out and spew some of the things that I see people spew on social media or even in public spaces that are not typed, right? So how are you as a father negotiating all of these things to try to make sure that your child, your son, your daughter is insulated from that hate, from the bile, the rhetoric that's out there? So in your home, what are you doing to sort of ensure that they're seeing things a bit different from what's out there?
I'm leveraging very fully, very consciously, very intentionally on my authority as their father. And the fact that in the first few years of their life, I am the most believable voice in their life. I can't shield them from society. They go out every day and they encounter these things. But when they come back, I help them to reinterpret. I help them to put things in perspective. That evil is not in ethnicity. it's in character. Good is not in religion, it's in character. And that's what you should always judge people by, their character. The fact that somebody says, I'm a Muslim, doesn't tell you anything about the kind of person they are going to be. It's their actions that tell you whether this is a good person or a bad person. The fact that somebody says, I'm Igbo or Hausa or Yoruba, doesn't tell you anything about them. It is how they treat you, how they act, that's what tells you whether they're a good or bad person. So I leverage very heavily on my authority as a father to reshape narratives for them.
Thank you very much, Dike. And just to add to it, that it's also important that you as a person understand these things, because if you don't have it, you can't give.
Absolutely.
So if you do not believe in these ideals, you're not going to be able to teach the person that's looking up to you. Absolutely. And it's also not about the things that you teach them. It's also about the offhand commentary that you make. You know, when they see a neighbor come in and talk and engage with you after they let, oh my Igbo, these Igbo people, and they're hearing, they're seeing it, right? And it's somewhere in their brain registering, even if they do not know it.
Absolutely.
So thank you very much, Dike, for coming on this show.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. And that is it, people. That's the big issue. Today, Dike Chukwumerije and I have talked about Nigeria's diversity, looked at the different axes of responsibility from the leadership to right down to the family unit, and even touching on the other ways and manners that we can manage Nigeria's union that is supposedly non-negotiable. And I actually love Dike's point out about that's what the president is expected to say. That's what the leadership is expected to say. We can have other conversations around what we think about it, but hopefully this conversation has enriched the way that we contribute to political and national discourse. The big issue is that show where we examine big ticket governance matters that affect all and sundry across the 36 states of the Federation and of course the FCT. My name is Buchi and I'll be speaking to you soon.